The recording was 11 seconds long. Daniel would remember the exact length for the rest of his life, because he counted it, over and over, in the silence after it ended. A woman's voice, flat and precise, saying words no one was supposed to hear. Then a small gasp, then nothing but static and the sound of something falling. He sat very still in the hospital chair, the toy recorder heavy in his palm, like it weighed more than the truth it held. His son was asleep 3 feet away, one arm in a cast, one hand still curled toward the device even in sleep. Daniel pressed play again. 6 days earlier, none of this existed. There was only a staircase, polished and quiet, in a house that had never once needed to lie about anything. Whitfield Hall sat at the center of 4,000 acres of Kentucky bluegrass, a house built by 2 generations of thoroughbred money and maintained, these days, by a staff who understood that silence was part of the job description. Daniel Whitfield had inherited the farm, the horses, and the particular quiet that comes from never having to raise your voice to be obeyed. He liked to say that Whitfield Hall ran itself. It didn't. It ran on people no one thought to mention in interviews, grooms, housekeepers, and, for the past 11 months, a soft-spoken speech and occupational therapist named Priya Anand, hired after Noah's bout of viral encephalitis, left him with a stammer, a weak right side, and a fear of loud rooms that no specialist in 3 states could quite explain away. It was Priya who had turned Noah's fear into something useful. Twice a week, during his speech exercises, she gave him the little red recorder, not a toy, technically, though he treated it like one and taught him a rule so simple it had become instinct. If you're scared and your words won't come, press the button first. Say it later when you're ready. The recording will wait for you. It had started as a trick to get a stuttering 6-year-old talking without pressure. By the 5th month, Noah carried the recorder everywhere, the way other children carried a stuffed animal. That morning, before any of it happened, Camille had sat across from Daniel's estate attorney in the study, reviewing language for the family trust that would formalize her place in Noah's life once the wedding was official. The clause was specific, a guardianship provision naming the primary maternal figure in the child's daily care as co-trustee of Noah's education fund should anything happen to Daniel. The attorney had used the word carefully, primary. Camille had asked, just as carefully, who currently fit that description in practice, not on paper. The attorney hadn't needed to answer. Everyone in that house already knew whose name the staff wrote down when Noah had a bad night, whose number the school called first, whose lap he crawled into when he was frightened. It wasn't going to be Camille's, not as things stood, and she had left that meeting with a headache and a very clear understanding that paperwork alone would not fix what daily proximity had already decided. She did not think of herself as someone capable of hurting a child. She thought of herself as someone correcting an arrangement that had quietly, unfairly gotten out of hand. The fall itself took less than 2 seconds. One moment, the grand staircase of Whitfield Hall stood empty and gleaming under the late afternoon light, angling through the tall windows. The next, a sharp crack split the quiet bone meeting stone, followed by a cry that stopped too fast, as if someone had reached in and switched it off. Priya was in the therapy room down the hall, folding a stack of resistance bands, when she heard it. She'd been humming to herself, something tuneless, the way she did when a session had gone well, and Noah had been in an unusually good mood that day, giggling at a joke about a talking horse he'd been rehearsing all week to tell his father at dinner. She didn't remember crossing the distance. She only remembered arriving at the bottom of the stairs to find Noah twisted on his side, his small body unnaturally still, his toy recorder bright red, a dangling nylon cord skidded 3 feet away against the baseboard. Noah. Her voice cracked on the single syllable. She dropped to her knees, hands hovering, afraid to touch him and afraid not to. Noah, sweetheart, don't move. I'm right here. Blood welled from a shallow cut above his eyebrow. His eyes fluttered, unfocused, found her face, and held there. Footsteps thundered from the 2nd floor. Daniel Whitfield appeared first, and whatever color had been in his face left it entirely the instant he saw his son on the marble. Camille came a half step behind him, one hand rising to cover her mouth in a gesture so smooth it looked rehearsed. "What happened?" Daniel dropped beside Priya, hands shaking as he checked his son's breathing. He was in his room. I heard him call out and then Priya's throat closed. I came as fast as I could. Camille's eyes moved briefly to the recorder on the floor, then back to Priya. "You were supposed to be with him for his afternoon session." I stepped away for less than 2 minutes to get his resistance bands. 2 minutes, Camille repeated, quiet and even, the way a woman repeats a number she intends to use again later. Daniel didn't hear the exchange. He was too busy saying his son's name over and over, like a man trying to hold a door shut with his voice alone. Noah whimpered, and his eyes searched the room until they found Priya's face and stayed there. The paramedics arrived 9 minutes later. Ray Kessler, the ranch's longtime stable foreman, had been the one to call them. He'd been crossing the courtyard when he heard Priya scream, and he stood now at the edge of the entry hall, hat in his hands, watching the stretcher come down the front steps. He had worked for the Whitfield family for 19 years. He had also, 3 weeks earlier, watched Camille stop halfway up those same stairs and stand very still, staring down at Noah playing on the landing below, for longer than anyone stares at a child by accident. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone. It wasn't his place, he told himself now, watching the stretcher pass. It never had been. A man who wanted to keep his job for a 20th year learned which things were his to say and which things belonged to people with more to lose than he had. As the stretcher reached the gravel drive, Noah's small hand lifted weakly into the air, fingers searching. "Priya," he murmured, barely audible over the crunch of tires. She caught his fingers gently, matching his stride to the ambulance doors. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." As the ambulance doors closed, Camille rested a hand lightly on Priya's shoulder. "He needs his parents right now," she said, and stepped back, and the space where her hand had been felt colder than it should have. The waiting room at Bluegrass Regional smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. Daniel paced a groove into the tile, his tie loosened, his hair disheveled in a way none of his board members would have recognized. Camille sat with her hands folded, dabbing occasionally at eyes that never quite produced tears. "This wouldn't have happened if someone had been paying proper attention," she said. "Not loudly, just loud enough. We don't know what happened yet." Daniel didn't stop pacing. "He's 6, Daniel. 6-year-olds need supervision, not 2 minutes of trust." Across the room, Priya sat rigid in a plastic chair, hands pressed flat against her knees to keep them from shaking. Every time a door opened, she flinched. A nurse passed and did not meet her eyes, and Priya understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the story of what had happened was already being written, and she was not the one holding the pen. A doctor finally emerged, exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. "Your son has a mild concussion and a fractured radius. He was fortunate 1 step higher, a different angle, and we'd be having a very different conversation." Daniel's knees nearly gave. "Can I see him? Both of you, briefly. Can I?" Priya's voice was smaller than she meant it to be. The doctor glanced at Daniel. Camille answered first. "He needs quiet, maybe just family, for now." Daniel looked at Priya, then really looked. For the first time since the stairs, and saw a woman who had cared for his son through 11 months of physical therapy, who had taught Noah to say his own name clearly again after the fever that nearly took his hearing, who was standing in a hallway being erased in real time by a sentence. 5 minutes, he said. "She comes too." Noah lay pale against the white sheets, his arm already set in a temporary splint, the recorder resting on the bedside table where a nurse had placed his personal effects. When he saw Priya, his whole face changed. "Priya." The word came out cracked, urgent. She crossed the room carefully, mindful of the IV line, and took his good hand. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're safe." "I didn't mean to fall." His eyes were wet. "I know. You didn't do anything wrong." She smoothed his hair back from the bandage. "Can you tell me what happened?" Noah's gaze flicked toward the door, then back to her, and dropped to a whisper. "She was mad at me." Priya's stomach turned to ice. Who was mad? The door opened before he could answer. Camille stepped in, smiling, her voice pitched warm and soft for an audience that had just arrived. "Oh, there you are, sweetheart. You gave us all such a scare." Noah went quiet instantly, his hand tightening in Priya's. "The doctor mentioned he needs calm," Camille said, glancing at the recorder on the table, then away. "Too much talking isn't good for a head injury right now." Priya stood slowly, forcing her voice level. "Of course. I'll come back later." As she left, she felt Camille's eyes follow her out sharp, assessing, already calculating something Priya couldn't yet name. That night, long after visiting hours ended, Daniel sat alone beside his sleeping son, the recorder untouched on the nightstand between them. Camille appeared in the doorway, arms folded loosely, composed in the particular way people are composed when they've had time to prepare. "We need to talk about today," she said. "About her. It was an accident, Camille." "Was it?" She tilted her head, and something in the gesture made him look up sharply. "She's very attached to him. People get careless when they mistake attachment for competence. She's cared for him for a year. He fell down the stairs on the one day she stepped away for 2 minutes. While she was supposed to be watching him," Camille said, evenly, and let the silence do the rest of the work. Down the corridor, Priya stood at a vending machine she wasn't really looking at, replaying the sound over and over, the crack, the scream, the fall, certain, in some wordless animal way, that she had missed something important, something that had happened just before she reached the stairs. She tried to remember the last thing she'd heard before Noah's cry. There had been a voice. She was almost sure of it. She just couldn't yet say whose. Back in the room, unnoticed by either adult, the little red light on Noah's recorder blinked once in the dark. It had never stopped running since the moment it hit the floor. Priya didn't go home right away. She sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for a long time, engine off, hands still on the wheel, as if she were driving somewhere. 11 months of Tuesdays and Thursdays ran through her mind, Noah's first full sentence after the fever, the day he stopped flinching at the sound of the dinner bell, the afternoon he'd handed her the recorder unprompted and said, all on his own, "I want to keep this rule forever." She had built something with that child. Patiently, one small victory at a time, the kind of work that never made headlines and never asked to. She thought about what Camille had said in the entry hall. 2 minutes, repeated like a number that would be written into a report somewhere, weighed against a year of Tuesdays and Thursdays, as if the two things belonged on the same scale. When she finally drove home, the roads were dark and empty, headlights sweeping over miles of white plank fencing she'd once found beautiful and now found only long. Her apartment, a converted carriage house on the far edge of the property that came with the job, felt colder than usual when she let herself in. She didn't turn on all the lights. She sat at her kitchen table with her coat still on and finally let herself cry, quietly, for exactly as long as it took the kettle to boil. And then she stopped, because crying wasn't going to get her back into that hospital room, and there was still a boy in there who needed someone to believe him. She thought about the voice Noah had mentioned. "She was mad at me." 3 words, and already Priya could feel the shape of a story being assembled around them that had nothing to do with what actually happened on those stairs. She didn't know yet how right she was. She only knew, lying awake long after midnight, that something about the last hour before the fall didn't sit correctly in her memory, like a photograph slightly out of frame, and that no one currently asking her questions seemed interested in finding out why. By morning, 2 detectives from the county sheriff's office were parked outside Whitfield Hall, and the story of what had happened to Noah Whitfield had already begun traveling through the small circle of people who worked the farm, changing shape slightly each time it was told. Ray Kessler heard 3 different versions before 9 a.m. In one, Priya had left Noah alone for 20 minutes. In another, she'd been on her phone. He said nothing to correct any of them, and hated himself a little for it, and went back to mucking stalls because it was easier than deciding what he owed anyone. Ray had almost said something to the younger detective when she'd asked him, offhand, whether anything unusual had happened at the house in the weeks before the fall. He'd opened his mouth. He'd thought of Camille standing on the stairs 3 weeks back, watching Noah play on the landing with an expression Ray hadn't been able to name at the time and still couldn't fully name now. Then he'd thought of his pension, 11 years from vesting, and the particular way Camille had of remembering exactly who had crossed her and exactly when. "Nothing comes to mind," he'd said, and the detective had nodded and moved on to the next groom, and Ray had gone back to work with a feeling in his stomach like swallowed gravel. Inside, the detective set up in the small study off the main hall, a room with too much light and not enough furniture, the kind of room designed to make people talk. The lead detective, a woman with a flat, patient voice and a notepad she rarely looked at, asked Priya to walk her through the afternoon. "I finished Noah's stretching exercises around 4:15, Priya said, hands folded tightly in her lap. "We were going to do a recording exercise next. That's part of his speech therapy. I went to the linen closet for his resistance bands. I was gone less than 2 minutes. Walk me through the therapy itself for a moment," the detective said. "What does a session usually look like?" "We work on articulation drills, mostly. Sometimes I have him record short sentences and play them back so he can hear the difference between what he intends to say and what actually comes out. It builds his confidence. He used to refuse to speak in front of anyone outside the family. Now he'll read a whole page aloud if you ask him." "And where was Noah during the 2 minutes you were gone?" "In the upstairs hallway. He likes to walk along the handrail while he waits. He's done it 100 times. Was anyone else in the house?" Priya hesitated, and the detective noticed the hesitation, the way detectives are trained to notice things. Camille was upstairs. I heard her voice, briefly, before I heard him fall. I didn't think anything of it at the time. What was she saying? I couldn't make out words, just tone. Priya's throat tightened. I should have paid more attention. I know how that sounds. "It sounds like you're telling me the truth," the detective said, which was not the same as telling her she wasn't in trouble. Down the hall, Daniel gave his statement separately. Camille seated beside him with her hand resting on his knee in a way that looked, to anyone watching, like comfort, and felt, to Daniel, like a hand keeping something in place. "Do you believe this was an accident?" the detective asked. Daniel opened his mouth to answer, and Camille answered first. "We believe there was negligence," she said gently, "the way a person delivers news they claim not to want to give. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because Noah is 6 years old, and he was unsupervised near a marble staircase, and I think we owe him more honesty than protecting someone's feelings." "Camille." Daniel's voice was low. "I'm thinking of Noah," she said, turning to him, her expression soft and unimpeachable. "We can't ignore facts because they're uncomfortable, Daniel. Not when it's him." The detective wrote something down. "Miss Voss, were you upstairs at the time of the fall?" "I was in my dressing room, at the far end of the hall," Camille said smoothly. "I heard him cry out and came immediately. I wish I'd been closer. I wish I'd seen it happen so we wouldn't be sitting here guessing." "Did you and Noah interact at all that afternoon, before the fall?" "Briefly. I said hello to him in the hallway on my way to change. He seemed fine." She said it without a flicker, the kind of ease that comes only from either complete innocence or a great deal of private rehearsal, and there was no way yet for anyone in that room to tell which. The detective closed her notepad. "We'll want to review the household security footage, if there is any." For the first time, something moved behind Camille's composure. Small, quick, gone, almost before it registered. "Of course," she said. "Whatever's helpful." Daniel felt, for the first time since the fall, a small, cold suspicion he didn't yet have words for, not about what had happened on the stairs, but about how quickly and how smoothly an answer had been prepared for a question he hadn't finished asking. Priya was asked to wait outside while they spoke to Daniel, and from the hallway she caught fragments of her own name through the door, said in tones she couldn't quite parse. When Daniel finally emerged, he wouldn't meet her eyes. "We need to talk," he said. "Later. Not now." Camille spent part of that afternoon in the estate office, ostensibly returning calls to well-wishers, actually reviewing the security system's coverage map with the quiet, methodical attention she brought to anything that threatened her. The cameras covered the front gate, the stable block, the wine cellar Daniel's grandfather had once worried about staff pilfering from. They did not cover the second-floor hallway outside Noah's room, a gap that had never bothered anyone before because nothing worth watching had ever happened there. She noted the gap the way she noted most things, filed it away, and did not mention it to the detectives because they hadn't asked, and volunteering information no one had requested was, in her experience, how careful people became careless. What she hadn't accounted for, because it had never once occurred to her to think of a 6-year-old's toy as an instrument, was the recorder. That afternoon, back at the hospital, Noah woke from a nap disoriented, his good hand immediately reaching for the recorder on the bedside table. Priya was there she'd come, despite what Camille had said, unwilling to leave him with no one who simply believed him. "Priya." His voice was still thick with sleep. "Did you hear it?" "Hear what, sweetheart?" "The stairs. I was scared. I wanted to record something." He looked at her carefully, the way children look at adults when they're testing whether the truth is safe to say out loud. Because she was yelling. Priya's pulse jumped. Who was yelling? "Noah." He opened his mouth to answer, and the door swung open. "Oh, good. You're awake." Camille's voice arrived a half-second before she did, warm and bright, aimed at an audience. "How's your head, sweetheart?" Noah went silent instantly, his small hand closing around the recorder like a shell folding shut. Camille's eyes moved to the device, lingered there. "That toy again. You should be resting. Too much noise isn't good for you right now." She reached over and moved the recorder to the far side of the room, out of his reach, her smile never faltering. "There. Better." Priya felt something harden in her chest, quiet and certain. "He said he wanted to show me something." "Another time," Camille said lightly, already turning toward the door. "Doctor's orders." When she was gone, Noah stared at the recorder across the room like it had been taken from him on purpose, which, Priya understood now with a clarity that frightened her, it had. That evening, Daniel found Priya in the corridor outside the hospital cafeteria, a paper cup of untouched coffee cooling in his hand. "The doctors think Noah needs stability right now," he said, not looking at her directly. "Fewer changes, fewer variables." Priya felt the floor shift under a sentence that hadn't finished yet. "What are you saying, Daniel?" "I think it's best if you take some time away. Just for now, while things settle." "Time away." She repeated it slowly, feeling the shape of what it actually meant settle into her chest like a stone. "You think I caused this?" He didn't answer, and the silence answered for him. "It's temporary," he said finally, which was the kind of thing people said when they didn't yet know whether it was true. "Daniel, listen to me." Priya made herself meet his eyes. Something happened on those stairs that had nothing to do with 2 minutes and a linen closet. Noah told me someone was mad at him right before he fell. He wouldn't say who, and every time he starts to, she walks into the room. Daniel's jaw tightened, but it was the tightening of a man defending a decision he wasn't sure of anymore, not one who believed what he was saying. He's 6. He's scared and confused, and kids say things that don't always mean what we think they mean. "You don't believe that?" Priya said. "I can see you don't." "What I believe doesn't matter right now," he said, and it was the first fully honest thing he'd said to her all day. "What matters is that my son is safe and calm, and I can't have this house feeling like a battlefield while he heals. I need you to trust me for a little while." "It's not you I don't trust," Priya said quietly. He didn't answer that. He couldn't, not yet, not without saying something he wasn't ready to say out loud to anyone, including himself. Priya nodded once, because there was nothing left to argue with, not yet, not with what little she had. "Then I hope the truth doesn't take too long to find you," she said quietly, and left the hospital that night with a box of her things from the therapy room and no idea when or if she'd be allowed back. Alone in his hospital bed an hour later, Noah waited until the hallway outside had gone quiet, until the machines had settled into their steady, familiar rhythm, and until he was reasonably sure no adult was going to walk through the door in the next few minutes. A nurse passed once, her shoes squeaking softly on the tile, and he lay very still with his eyes half closed until the sound faded. Then he reached, slowly, favoring his splinted arm, wincing at the pull of the IV tape on his skin, across the narrow gap between the bed and the side table, and closed his fingers around the recorder Camille had pushed out of reach. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for. He only knew what Priya had taught him, months ago, in a much calmer room. If you're scared and your words won't come, press record. Say it later. The recording will wait for you. He scrolled through the files with his thumb, slow and careful, the small screen throwing pale light across his face in the dark. Most of the files were labeled with the shaky, uneven symbols he used before he'd learned his letters properly: a star for good days, a cloud for sad ones. Near the bottom of the list, one file was marked with a jagged scribble he didn't remember drawing. He pressed play. At first there was only static, then footsteps, close and quick, and then a voice, Camille's voice, but wrong somehow, sharper than he'd ever heard it in front of his father, stripped of all its warmth. "Stop following me. You're always in the way." Noah's own voice answered, small and nervous. "I just wanted to show Priya." The recording cut off in a burst of noise, fabric pulling, a sharp gasp, and then nothing. Noah sat frozen in the dark hospital room, the recorder still warm in his hand, his heart going so fast he could feel it in his ears. He played it again, quieter this time, his thumb hovering over the volume button, as if a smaller sound might make the words smaller too. It didn't. The voice was the same both times, and so were the words, and so was the sound that came right after them, the one he didn't have a name for but that his body remembered anyway, a rushing, falling feeling that lived somewhere behind his ribs. He thought about pressing the button that would delete the file. His thumb found it in the dark and rested there, not pressing, for a long moment. Then he thought of Priya and the rules she'd taught him, and the fact that she was somewhere out in the dark right now believing something had been her fault when it hadn't. He moved his thumb away from delete. He didn't tell his father that night. He didn't tell anyone. He turned the recorder off, tucked it under his pillow where his good hand could still reach it, and lay awake a long time listening to the machine's beep, holding on to the one true thing in the room like it was the only solid ground left. That wasn't an accident. Noah came home from the hospital 4 days later to a house that felt different in ways he couldn't name but felt everywhere. The way a room feels different after someone rearranges the furniture while you were asleep. Priya's carriage house sat dark at the edge of the property, its windows blank. No one had told him where she'd gone. When he asked, the answers were soft and vague in a way that made him more afraid than a direct answer would have. "She's just taking some time," his father said, not quite meeting his eyes, which Noah had learned by now meant the opposite of whatever came next in the sentence. Camille, by contrast, had settled into the house with an ease that felt, to Noah, like watching someone move furniture into a room that wasn't theirs. She oversaw his meals. She sat with him during his afternoon rest, reading aloud from books he didn't particularly like in a voice pitched for an audience of one grateful, watching housekeeper who happened to be dusting the hallway just outside his door. That housekeeper, a woman named Marisol who had worked at Whitfield Hall for 6 years, had her own private theory about what had happened on the stairs, formed from small things, the way Camille's smile dropped the instant Noah's door closed, the way she'd once seen Camille grip Noah's arm harder than necessary, steering him away from a window seat he loved, the offhand comment Camille had made in the kitchen the week before the fall about how children who were overly attached to hired help grew up entitled and confused about family. Marisol had said nothing to anyone about any of it. She had 2 children of her own and a mortgage and a green card renewal working its way through a system that seemed designed to punish anyone who drew attention to themselves. And she had learned, the hard way, at a different house years earlier, what happened to staff who spoke up about employers with more money and better lawyers than they'd ever have. That family had let her predecessor go within a week of a similar complaint, over something else entirely, and made very sure the reason given had nothing to do with the complaint at all. Marisol had watched it happen and understood the lesson was meant for her too. Still, some mornings, dusting the console table outside Noah's door, she found herself lingering a few seconds longer than the job required, listening for something she couldn't have named even to herself, telling herself it was only concern for a child recovering from a bad fall, and knowing, in the part of her that had raised 2 children of her own, that it was more than that, and that her silence was costing something even if no one ever asked her to name the price. 3 days after coming home, Noah asked Camille directly, in the kind of unguarded moment children sometimes produce without meaning to, whether Priya was ever coming back. Camille set down the book she'd been reading and studied him for a long moment. That depends on a lot of things, sweetheart. Grown-up things. What things? Whether people can be trusted to keep you safe. She said it gently, almost kindly, and that was the part that frightened him most, that cruelty could wear an expression this soft. You want to be safe, don't you, Noah? He nodded, because that was the expected answer, and because some instinct he didn't have words for yet told him that disagreeing with her right now would cost him something. Good boy. Camille smiled, and reached out to smooth his hair the way she'd seen Priya do 100 times, and the gesture landed wrong on him, borrowed and hollow, like a costume worn by someone who'd studied the part but never felt it. You know, some children exaggerate things when they're scared. They mix up dreams and memories. It's very normal after a bump on the head like yours. Doctors have a name for it. What name? It doesn't matter. Just if you ever think you remember something strange from before you fell, it's probably just a confused dream. It happens to lots of children. You don't need to tell anyone about dreams. It would only upset your father for nothing. Noah said nothing. He had learned, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, that the safest answer around Camille was often no answer at all. Then we should probably let the grown-ups handle it, Camille said, closing the subject as smoothly as she'd opened it, and picked the book back up. Noah sat very still beside her, the recorder a small hard weight against his hip, where he'd started keeping it tucked into the waistband of his pajama pants, always within reach, the way other children kept a hand near a nightlight. Ray Kessler had his own reckoning that week, though no one witnessed it but a pair of quarter horses and an empty stable aisle. He'd been asked, almost in passing, by one of the younger grooms, whether he thought the maid had really done it. Ray had shrugged and said he didn't know, which was, strictly, the truth, and also the first time in 19 years he'd let a lie stand in for silence, and called it caution. That night he sat in his truck in the gravel lot behind the barn long after his shift ended, engine off, watching the lit windows of Whitfield Hall across the dark field. He thought about the day on the stairs, 3 weeks before the fall. Camille standing very still, watching a boy who wasn't hers with an expression Ray now understood, too late, exactly how to name. He thought about his daughter, 26 and working 2 jobs in Lexington, who told him once that the worst thing about being poor wasn't the money, it was how much of the truth you had to swallow to keep the roof over your head. He thought that if she knew what he was sitting on right now, she'd tell him to walk into that sheriff's office in the morning regardless of what it cost him. He didn't walk in the next morning, but he stopped correcting the rumors about Priya out loud when he heard them repeated in the tack room. And for Ray, that small refusal felt, for the first time in weeks, like the beginning of doing something instead of nothing. Daniel, meanwhile, was drowning in a version of guilt that had no clear shore. He had spent 11 days replaying every conversation with Priya, every glance she and Noah had exchanged, every ordinary Tuesday afternoon that now felt, in hindsight, like evidence of something he couldn't name. He found himself standing at the top of the staircase more than once, staring down at the marble, trying to reconstruct 2 minutes he hadn't witnessed from the fragments of a story that kept subtly rearranging itself depending on who told it. He called Priya twice. Both times, he hung up before it rang through, unsure what he intended to say, unsure whether saying it would be an act of loyalty to his son or a betrayal of the caution every advisor around him kept urging. You need to give this time, Camille told him one evening, refilling his glass without being asked, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. Noah's healing. The house is calm again. Don't disturb that over a feeling you can't quite explain. It's not just a feeling, Camille. He asked me yesterday if you think Priya would hurt him. Where would a 6-year-old get an idea like that on his own? Children absorb tension, Camille said, unbothered. He's been surrounded by adults whispering about blame for 2 weeks. Of course he's confused about who to be afraid of. That's exactly why consistency matters right now. One steady voice. One home. Not a revolving door of people telling him different stories about what happened to him. It was, Daniel would think much later. One of the most effective sentences anyone had ever said to him, not because it was true, but because it gave his exhaustion permission to stop asking questions, and because it was delivered by someone who had clearly rehearsed exactly which words would land softest on a man too tired to argue. The security footage came back from the county lab on the 12th day, and it told the detectives almost nothing. The camera at the top of the main stairs had malfunctioned 3 weeks earlier. A loose connection, maintenance logs showed, nothing suspicious on its face, and had not been recording at all on the afternoon of the fall. The gap Camille had noted so carefully in the estate office had turned out, conveniently, to already exist. The detective who delivered this news to Daniel watched his face carefully as she said it. "It happens," she said. "Old wiring, old houses. But I'll be honest with you, Mr. Whitfield, in a case like this, no footage usually means we build the case out of testimony instead. And testimony, so far, is thin. Nobody actually saw your son fall. What does that mean for Priya? It means we can't clear her, and we can't charge her. It means, right now, this case is exactly where it was on day 1. She paused. Sometimes these things resolve themselves, sometimes they don't. I'd encourage you to think hard about anyone in that house who might know more than they're currently saying. Daniel thought of Ray Kessler's carefully blank face during his interview. He thought of Marisol, who always seemed to find a reason to be somewhere else whenever Camille entered a room. He thought, for the first time, with real suspicion instead of vague unease, of his fiancée's absolute, unwavering calm through 11 days that had left him barely able to sleep. That night, unable to settle, Daniel walked past Noah's room and heard, faintly, his son's voice through the door, murmuring something too quiet to make out. He almost knocked. Instead, some instinct made him pause, hand raised, and listen. "And then you go home, and I'll press play, and Daddy will know," Noah was whispering, to no one, or perhaps to the recorder itself, the way children rehearse things they're too afraid to say out loud to a person. "And she won't be able to say I made it up, because it's her voice, not mine." Daniel's blood went cold in a way it hadn't since the moment he'd seen his son twisted on the marble floor. He pushed the door open. Noah startled, one hand flying instinctively to hide something beneath his pillow. "Noah." Daniel kept his voice very gentle, the way you'd approach a bird that might startle off a windowsill. "What did you just say?" Noah's eyes filled instantly. Guilt and relief tangled together in a way only children manage. "I wasn't supposed to tell," he whispered. "She said grown-ups don't need to hear a broken toy." "Who said that?" Noah's hand trembled as it emerged from beneath the pillow, the small red recorder held out toward his father like an offering, or a confession, or both. "I recorded it," Noah said, his voice cracking on every word. "Daddy, I recorded what she said, right before I fell." "Recorded what, Noah?" Daniel's own voice came out unsteady, quieter than he intended. "What did you record?" "I don't know all of it. I was scared, so I did what Priya taught me. Press first. Listen later." Noah's eyes were huge in the dim room. "I listened to some of it at the hospital. I didn't want to. I made myself. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because she said if I told anyone, Priya would never come back, and it would be my fault." Noah's chin trembled. "And because I was scared it would make you sad. And because part of me thought maybe I misheard it, and if I told you and I was wrong, everyone would be mad at me instead of her." Daniel felt something in his chest crack open, some final piece of denial he hadn't realized he was still holding on to. He knelt beside the bed, taking the recorder from his son's hand with a gentleness that didn't match the violence of what he was feeling. "You are the bravest person in this house," he said, low and fierce. "Do you understand me? None of this is your fault. None of it." Noah nodded, tears finally spilling over, relief and terror mixed together on his small face in a way that would stay with Daniel for the rest of his life. The hallway outside seemed to go utterly silent, as if the whole house were holding its breath alongside them, and Daniel, staring at the small device now resting in his own palm, understood in one terrible instant that whatever he pressed play on next was going to end his engagement. possibly his marriage before it even began, and quite possibly everything he thought he'd understood about the woman sleeping 2 doors down the hall. His thumb hovered over the button. Daniel pressed play. For 11 seconds, the room held nothing but Camille's voice, flat and controlled in a register she never used in front of anyone who mattered to her. "Stop following me. You're always in the way," followed by Noah's small, frightened response. Then the sound of fabric pulling, a gasp, and silence. Daniel sat on the edge of his son's bed and played it again. Then a third time, as if repetition might reveal some innocent explanation hiding underneath the words, some context that would make this bearable. It didn't. The voice was unmistakable, the tone was unmistakable, and the 11 seconds before the fall told a story that had nothing to do with 2 minutes and a linen closet. "Daddy?" Noah's voice was very small. Daniel looked up and made himself say the thing his son needed to hear before anything else. "You did exactly the right thing. Do you hear me? Exactly right." He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the chair beside Noah's bed until dawn, the recorder in his lap, running through 11 months of small warning signs. He'd let himself explain away Camille's stiffness whenever Priya and Noah laughed together. The offhand comments about boundaries and hired help he'd dismissed as harmless opinion, the particular chill that entered a room whenever his son reached for someone who wasn't her. He thought about the trust clause the estate attorney had mentioned in passing weeks ago, the language about a primary maternal figure, and understood, with a sick clarity, that he had been looking at a woman auditioning for a role on paper while his son quietly, wordlessly, kept choosing someone else for the real one. He thought about how much easier it had been, for 11 days, to believe a story about a careless caregiver stepping away for 2 minutes than to look directly at the woman he'd asked to marry him and wonder what she was capable of when she thought no one was watching. Convenience had done a great deal of his thinking for him, he realized. It usually did, for people who could afford not to look too closely at the things that made their lives comfortable. He called the detectives at 7 the next morning, before Camille was awake, and met them in the estate office with the door closed. He played the recording once. The lead detective listened with her jaw set, took the recorder carefully into an evidence bag, and made a call that had 2 patrol cars in the gravel drive within the hour. Camille was still in her dressing gown when they knocked, composure fully intact, the way it always was until the exact moment it wasn't. "What is this?" she asked, looking from the detectives to Daniel, who stood in the hallway behind them, unable to meet her eyes and unwilling to look away. "We have some questions about a recording, Miss Voss," the detective said. "We'd like you to come with us voluntarily. If you'd rather, we can do this differently." A recording. Camille's laugh was thin, brittle at the edges. From a child's broken toy? You're building a case on a 6-year-old's imagination? "We'll need you to come in," the detective repeated, and something in the flatness of her voice made it clear the question had already been answered, regardless of what Camille said next. Camille turned to Daniel, and for the first time since he'd known her, something genuine flickered across her face. Not guilt, exactly, but calculation curdling fast into fear. "Richard, tell them how absurd this is." "It's Daniel," he said quietly. "You've been calling me the wrong name for 3 days and I only just noticed." It wasn't an accusation. It was simply the truest thing he'd said in weeks, and it landed harder than anything the detectives had said so far. The interview lasted most of the morning. Camille denied everything at first, calmly, methodically, the same performance she'd given the detectives 11 days earlier when there had been no recording to contradict her. She suggested the audio had been manipulated, pointed out, with the composure of someone reciting a memorized argument, that toy recorders had cheap microphones prone to distortion, and that any half-competent audio engineer could produce a similar clip from unrelated footage. She suggested Priya had coached the boy, perhaps unconsciously, out of her own resentment at being asked to step back from his care. She suggested, with a coldness that made even the detective's pen pause mid-sentence, that a frightened, traumatized child was an unreliable narrator of his own life, and that any competent professional would know better than to build a case on his account. The detective let her talk. Experienced interviewers know that people who are innocent tend to ask questions: what evidence, what timeline, what happens next, while people who are guilty tend to explain, at length, why the evidence can't mean what it obviously means. Camille explained for the better part of 40 minutes, and every explanation added one more brick to a wall the detective could already see the shape of. It was the third suggestion that undid her, because it was the one moment she forgot to sound like someone who cared what happened to Noah at all. "You're saying my son is lying," Daniel said, from the corner of the room where he'd insisted on staying. "I'm saying children get confused." "He's not confused. I heard your voice, Camille. I've heard your voice every day for 2 years. I know exactly what it sounds like when you're not performing for an audience." Something in her cracked then, not remorse, but the particular fury of someone whose careful architecture has finally, irreversibly, come apart. "He was always in the way," she said, and her voice had gone flat and cold, in a way that matched the recording exactly, stripped of every warm inflection she'd ever used in front of Daniel. "Always clinging to that woman instead of his own family. Always going to be the reason I never had a real place in this house, on paper or otherwise. I didn't plan for him to fall down an entire staircase. I only meant to get him away from that door before she came back and saw us together. He pulled back too hard. That's all that happened. That's the whole truth, if anyone actually wants it." The room went very quiet. Even the detective, who had heard a great many confessions in a long career, took a moment before she spoke. "Camille Voss, you're under arrest for felony child endangerment and assault of a minor." As the cuffs closed, Camille looked at Daniel with something that might have once resembled affection, curdled entirely into contempt. "You'll lose everything defending that Maid's version of events. The company, the board, everything your grandfather built." "I'd rather lose all of it," Daniel said, "than lose him believing no one ever listened." Marisol was polishing the banister at the top of the main stairs when they brought Camille through the entry hall, and she did not look away, not this time. She watched the woman she had quietly distrusted for months walk past in handcuffs, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight since the day of the fall. Not triumph exactly, but the particular relief of watching a truth she'd been too afraid to speak get spoken by someone else, someone the world had no choice but to believe. Ray Kessler heard the news within the hour, second-hand, from a groom who'd seen the patrol cars from the paddock fence. He stood very still for a long moment afterward, hat in his hands, and thought about the 3 weeks of silence he'd kept, and the daughter in Lexington who worked 2 jobs and still believed her father was a better man than his silence had suggested lately. He didn't feel proud of himself, but he felt, for the first time in weeks, that the ground under Whitfield Hall had tilted back toward something like honesty, even if he hadn't been the one to tilt it. Daniel called Priya from the driveway before the patrol car had even cleared the front gate, his hands still shaking. She didn't answer the first time. She answered the second. Noah recorded her, he said, before she could speak, before pride or caution could talk him out of the plainest version of the truth, before the fall. He recorded exactly what happened. "It's real, Priya. It was never you." There was a long silence on the line, long enough that he thought the call had dropped. Then, quietly, "Is he all right?" "He's scared. He's been carrying this alone for almost 2 weeks because he was afraid no one would believe him over her." Daniel's voice broke on the last word. "He needs you. I need you to come back, if you're willing. I know I don't have the right to ask that after how I handled this." "I'm not coming back for you, Daniel," Priya said, and there was no cruelty in it, only exhaustion and something that might, underneath, have been the beginning of forgiveness. "I'm coming back for him. That's the only reason that matters," Daniel said. "Please, come home." There was another pause, shorter this time. "I need you to understand something first," Priya said. "For 11 days, I sat in a rented room wondering if a family I'd given a year of my life to actually believed I could hurt a child. That's not a small thing to carry. I'm not angry at you for being careful, Daniel, but I am telling you, clearly, that I won't be put in that position again just because it's convenient in some future moment to doubt me instead of asking harder questions of someone with more power in that house." "I hear you," Daniel said, and meant it in a way he hadn't quite managed to mean anything in the last 2 weeks. "You were the only person in this house who never once lied to me. I should have weighted that a great deal more than I did." "You should have," she agreed without softening it, and then, quieter, "But you're the one who called me the moment you knew. That matters too." After he hung up, Daniel stood alone in the driveway for a long moment, the gravel crunching faintly under his shifting weight, watching the patrol car carrying Camille grow smaller down the long lane toward the county road. He thought, briefly and with a kind of detached exhaustion, about the calls he'd need to make before the story broke somewhere beyond this valley: the board, the family attorney, the trust officer who drafted language for a woman who no longer had any claim to the word maternal in this house. None of it felt urgent yet. It would, by morning. For now there was only the stress. She arrived within the hour, her carriage house key still on the ring beside her car keys where she'd never quite made herself remove it, and the moment Noah saw her car turn up the long gravel drive from his bedroom window, he was out of the bed and down the hallway faster than his splinted arm should have allowed, his father catching him at the top of the stairs to keep him from tumbling on the very steps that had started all of this. They came down together, slowly, deliberately, Daniel's hand steady under his son's good arm, until they reached the bottom where Priya was already waiting, having let herself in through the front door without knocking, some instinct telling her that today, of all days, she didn't need permission to walk back into this house. She knelt at the bottom of the staircase, arms open, and Noah folded into them like something coming back into its proper shape. "You believed me," he said into her shoulder, half question, half wonder, as if he hadn't quite dared to hope it was true. "I always believed you," she said, holding him tighter. "I just didn't have the proof yet. You found it yourself. Do you understand how brave that was? Braver than most grown-ups I know?" Noah pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes red but steadier than they'd been in days. "You said press the button first. Say it later when you're ready." "I did say that." "I said it later," Noah said, and something in his small, solemn face made both adults in that entry hall, for one unguarded moment, laugh through tears at the same time, the first genuinely light sound the house had held in almost 2 weeks. Behind them, on the same marble step where Noah had fallen, the little red recorder sat where Daniel had set it down, its work finally, completely done. Marisol, passing through the hall with an armful of linens, paused just long enough to watch the three of them there at the foot of the stairs, and allowed herself, for the first time in 6 years of careful invisibility, a small private smile that had nothing to do with her job description at all. The weeks after Camille's arrest moved at 2 different speeds. Legally, everything accelerated. The county attorney's office moved quickly once the recording was authenticated by an independent audio lab, and Camille's own attorney, faced with a confession captured on tape and corroborated by a 6-year-old's testimony that hadn't changed in a single detail across 3 separate interviews, began quietly negotiating a plea rather than risk a trial in front of a jury that would hear Noah's small, steady voice describing exactly what had happened to him. Emotionally, everything slowed down, the way a house does after a long fever finally breaks, when the exhaustion of having been sick for so long outlasts the illness itself by weeks. The story reached the local papers within days. Then the wider financial press, once someone connected Daniel's name to the horse operation's recent expansion into 2 other states. Reporters called the estate office more times in a week than they had in the previous decade combined. Daniel answered almost none of them, on the advice of counsel and, more honestly, because he found he had no appetite left for explaining his family's worst month to strangers who wanted a headline more than they wanted the truth. The one statement he did release was 4 sentences long and mentioned Priya by name, publicly and without qualification, as the person who had cared for his son with more consistency than anyone else in that house, staff or otherwise. It cost him nothing to say. It had cost her a great deal, for 11 days, that no one had said it sooner. A handful of board members quietly suggested, in the weeks that followed, that the family might consider a more curated public narrative, perhaps framing the arrest as a private matter resolved discreetly, distancing the company brand from anything resembling a scandal involving a child. Daniel listened to the suggestion once, in full, without interrupting, and then declined it flatly. My son already spent 2 weeks having his own account of what happened to him, minimized by people who found the truth inconvenient, he told them. I'm not doing that to him again for a quarterly earnings call. The board didn't raise the subject a second time, and Daniel noticed, with a mixture of relief and quiet vindication, that the company's reputation survived the honesty perfectly well, largely because most people, given the plain facts, understood exactly which side of the story deserved their sympathy. The lead detective closed the case file that same month and stopped by the farm once, unofficially, on her way through the county, mostly to see how the boy who'd cracked it open was doing. She found him in the yard, chasing one of the barn cats with far more energy than the case notes had led her to expect from a child 2 months out of a fractured arm. He looks good, she told Daniel, watching Noah tumble in the grass, laughing. Most kids who go through something like that carry it a long time before you'd know it to look at them. He carries it, Daniel said. He's just not carrying it alone anymore. The detective nodded, filed that answer away the way she filed most things worth remembering, and left without further comment, though she would mention the case, years later, to younger colleagues, as one of the rare ones where the evidence had arrived exactly when it was needed, and from precisely the person everyone else had been too quick to overlook. Noah's cast came off 6 weeks after the fall. The bruise on his forehead faded to a thin white scar just above his eyebrow, small enough that most people wouldn't notice it unless they knew to look. His nightmares didn't disappear all at once. Some nights he woke gasping, certain for a confused half-second that he was back on the marble at the bottom of the stairs, and Priya would sit with him until his breathing evened out, saying almost nothing, letting her presence do the work words couldn't. You're safe, she told him, every time. You're heard. Daniel began sitting in on those nights too, sometimes, learning slowly what it actually looked like to protect someone, not the grand, decisive version he'd imagined himself capable of, but the small, patient, repetitive version that mostly consisted of showing up in the dark, again and again, until a child's body believed what his words had already told him. He was, by his own private admission, not naturally good at this kind of patience. He'd built a career on decisive action, on solving problems in a single meeting and moving on to the next one. Noah's healing didn't work that way, and Daniel found himself relearning, at 41, a kind of attention he'd never had much use for before, the kind that didn't fix anything quickly, but simply stayed. One night, Noah woke crying harder than usual, certain, in the particular logic of nightmares, that Camille was still somewhere in the house. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and didn't try to argue him out of the fear directly. Instead, he said quietly, "She's not coming back. Not because I'm telling you to feel better, because it's a fact. The same way your recorder was a fact. You can check on it whenever you need to. I'll tell you the truth every single time you ask, even the hard parts." Noah studied him for a long moment, weighing the promise the way children weigh most things, against everything that had come before it, and eventually nodded, and eventually slept. The plea hearing happened on an ordinary Tuesday in late autumn, in a courtroom with none of the drama true crime specials would later manufacture around it. A handful of reporters sat in the gallery, along with Marisol, who had asked for the day off specifically to be there, sitting quietly in the back row with her hands folded, bearing witness in a way she hadn't allowed herself to during the months when it might have cost her something. Camille pleaded guilty to felony child endangerment and assault of a minor in exchange for a sentence recommendation of 7 years, of which the prosecutor privately told Daniel she'd likely serve less than half. Noah wasn't required to testify. He'd been prepared to, had told his father plainly, weeks earlier, "If I don't, she might do this to someone else's kid." But the plea made that particular courage unnecessary, and Priya, watching Daniel's face when the news came through, saw something in him unclench that had been rigid since the night he'd pressed play on that recorder. Camille said little at sentencing beyond the minimum her attorney required. She did not apologize. When the judge asked if she had anything to add, she looked once, briefly, toward the back of the courtroom where Daniel sat, and said only, "Some people mistake attachment for love and call it family. I was never going to win against that." Then she looked away, and didn't look back again, and Daniel understood, watching her let out, that she had never once, in the entire ordeal, referred to Noah by name. Outside the courthouse afterward, Marisol found Priya on the steps, and without quite planning to, told her about the day on the stairs weeks before the fall, the thing she'd never mentioned to the detectives out of fear for her own family's stability. "I should have said something sooner," Marisol said. "I keep thinking about that." "You said it eventually," Priya told her. "That's more than a lot of people manage. It wasn't absolution, exactly, but it was as close as either of them needed, standing there in the cold autumn light, two women who had each carried a piece of the same silence for longer than either would have liked. Daniel sold nothing as dramatic as the estate itself. Whitfield Hall had been in the family for 3 generations, and the horses didn't care what had happened on the staircase, but he did something quieter that mattered more inside the house than any headline would have. He had the second-floor hallway cameras finally repaired, the gap Camille had once noted so carefully closed for good, and he had a new guardianship clause drawn up for Noah's trust, one that named, in plain language rather than euphemism, the people who had actually shown up for his son during the worst month of his life. Priya's name was on it. So, at Daniel's insistence and over her own embarrassed protest, was Marisol's, in recognition of a kind of quiet, unglamorous loyalty that had gone unpaid in every sense of the word for 6 years. He also did something Ray Kessler hadn't expected and would remember for the rest of his time at the farm. He asked him, directly, one afternoon in the stable aisle, whether there was anything he'd noticed in the weeks before the fall that he hadn't felt able to say at the time. Ray was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat over in his hands, and then told him about the day on the stairs, 3 weeks before. The way Camille had watched Noah with an expression he'd never been able to name until it was too late to matter. "Why didn't you say something?" Daniel asked, and there was no accusation in it, only genuine, tired curiosity. "Because you don't work 19 years somewhere and learn to say things like that out loud, not about the woman who's about to be your boss's wife," Ray said. "Not until it's already too late to cost you anything for saying it." Daniel absorbed that without arguing, because there was nothing to argue with. "I'm changing that," he said. "Starting now. If anyone on this property ever sees something that worries them about my son, I want to hear it the same day, and I want them to know nothing happens to their job for telling me the truth." It wasn't a grand policy. It was one man, keeping one promise, to the people who worked land he'd never once thought to ask what silence cost them. But Ray went back to his stalls that afternoon feeling, for the first time in 19 years, that the ground under his feet had shifted toward something a little more honest. The promise turned out to mean something beyond words within the year. In late summer, a young groom new to the farm noticed a delivery truck driver being unusually rough, handling a shipment near the paddocks where children sometimes played, and mentioned it to Ray without hesitating, the way people do when they've watched, firsthand, what happens when someone finally decides silence isn't worth its price. Ray brought it straight to Daniel that same afternoon. Nothing came of the incident itself. The driver was simply reassigned to a different route, but the 6 minutes it took for a concern to travel from a nervous groom to the property owner, with no one weighing their job security against what they'd seen, was itself the measure of something that had genuinely changed at Whitfield Hall, quietly, permanently, in a way no lawsuit or headline could have produced. Winter came to the farm the way it always had, turning the bluegrass pale and the fence lines white with frost most mornings. Noah went back to school in January, carrying his recorder in his backpack for the first few weeks, not because he needed it anymore, but because its weight against his back reminded him that his voice had mattered once, enormously, when it counted. His teacher, unaware of the specifics but attentive to the shape of things, noticed he'd become quieter in class discussions for a few weeks, and more insistent, almost stubbornly so, whenever another student was accused of something without being given a chance to explain. She mentioned it gently to Daniel at a parent conference, not as a concern exactly, more as an observation she thought a father might want to have. Daniel thanked her and said nothing further, because some things belonged to his son's own account of that year, and weren't his to hand out even to well-meaning teachers. By February, Noah had stopped bringing the recorder. He didn't need the proof anymore. He'd started to understand, in the particular way children absorb lessons without anyone having to explain them directly, that what had saved him wasn't the recorder itself but the habit someone patient had taught him months before he ever needed it, of trusting his own account of what happened to him, even when the adults around him didn't. One afternoon in early spring, he came home from school with a single sheet of paper, the handwriting careful and uneven in the way of a child working very hard to make his letters behave. "I wrote something," he announced, holding it out to Priya with the particular pride of someone who'd finally gotten a hard thing right. She read it standing at the kitchen counter, one short sentence, 7 words, printed twice as large as it needed to be. "If you are scared, tell the truth." "That's very wise," Priya said, and meant it. Noah shrugged, in the way 6-year-olds shrug off compliments about things they consider simply obvious. "I learned it," he said, "from the worst day of my life, but also from you, before that." That same spring, Noah asked Priya a question one evening while they sat on the porch steps watching the last light drain out of the fields. "Do you think bad people know they're bad?" Priya considered it carefully, the way she considered most things he asked her, refusing to hand him an answer smaller than the question deserved. "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes they just decide what they want matters more than who gets hurt getting it. I don't think most people wake up planning to become someone cruel. I think it happens slowly, one small decision at a time, until being cruel just feels like being practical." Noah frowned, turning that over. "I don't want to be like that. Ever." "You won't be," Priya said, with more certainty than she usually allowed herself about the future, "because you already know what it feels like not to be believed. People who remember that feeling tend to be very careful about doing it to someone else." He seemed to accept that, filing it away the way he filed most hard truths these days, without needing it resolved immediately, only understood. They sat together a while longer as the fireflies started up along the fence line, not talking, which had become, in its own way, one of Priya's favorite sounds in the world, a child comfortable enough in silence that he no longer needed to fill it out of fear. That winter, before the thaw, the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property had frozen thick enough for Noah to stand at its bank, bundled against the cold, watching the ice crack and shift in slow, groaning lines beneath the weight of a fallen branch. "It looks strong," he said, "but it breaks pretty easy." "Some things do," Priya said, standing beside him with her hands in her coat pockets. "They look solid right up until something tests them, and then you find out what they were actually made of." He nodded slowly, in the particular way he had these days of absorbing an idea larger than his years and setting it carefully somewhere he could find it again later. Daniel proposed to no one that year, and told anyone who asked, with more honesty than diplomacy, that he intended to spend a long while learning the difference between confidence and character before he trusted his own judgment about either one again. His board found the sudden caution unsettling in a man who'd built a reputation on decisiveness. Daniel found, to his own mild surprise, that he didn't much care what the board thought of his pace anymore. Some decisions, he'd learned the hard way, deserved to be slow. What he did do, on a warm evening in early June, was gather Noah and Priya in the living room that had once felt, to Priya, like the coldest room in a very cold house, and ask her, plainly, without ceremony, to stay. "I'm not asking out of guilt," he said, before she could answer, watching her face carefully, "or obligation. Noah needs consistency, and so, frankly, do I, but that's not why I'm asking either. I'm asking because you were the only person in this house who never once needed anyone's permission to tell the truth, and I think that's worth building something around." "That's a generous way to describe someone you almost let walk out the door for good," Priya said, not unkindly, but not letting him off easily either. "It is," Daniel agreed. "I'm not asking you to forget that part. I'm asking you to let me spend a long time proving it won't happen again." Priya looked at Noah, who watched her without speaking, the particular stillness of a child who has learned, the hard way, exactly how much silence can cost and how much a single honest answer can be worth. "I'll stay," she said. "Not as staff, not as a favor to anyone. As family, if that's what this is actually going to be. That's what it's going to be, Daniel said, and for the first time since the day of the fall, the words felt entirely, uncomplicatedly true. Noah, watching the two adults he trusted most in the world finally say plainly what he'd already understood for months, allowed himself something he hadn't quite risked since before the fall. He ran across the room and threw both arms around Priya's waist without being asked, without needing permission, the particular unguarded joy of a child who no longer had to calculate what a hug might cost him. Priya held him, laughing despite the sudden tightness in her throat. And over the top of his head she caught Daniel's eye, and neither of them needed to say anything further about it. Years later, Noah would remember very little of the courtroom, the plea hearing, the specific legal language of felony endangerment. What he would remember clearly, for the rest of his life, was the sound of a small red button clicking under his thumb in a dark hospital room, the particular fear of being 6 years old and certain no adult would believe him, and the moment, much later, when someone finally did. He would remember Priya's rule, worn smooth from repetition until it stopped being advice and became simply a part of how he moved through the world. If you're scared and the words won't come, save them. Say them later when you're ready. Somebody, eventually, will listen. He would also remember, though more faintly, the particular ache of watching his father's face the night the recording played for the first time, not fear of Camille. By then, but something gentler and harder to name, the recognition that his father had chosen, in the end, to believe him over the comfortable version of events, even though it cost him almost everything he'd built his adult life around. It was a small thing to carry forward, that memory, but it turned out to be one of the sturdiest things a child could inherit. Proof, permanent and specific, that being believed was possible, even by people who had gotten it badly wrong at first. And Daniel would remember, longer than he remembered almost anything else from that year, the precise weight of a small red recorder in his open palm and the particular silence of a house finally telling the truth about itself after months of choosing, quietly and comfortably, not to. He would remember, too, standing at the top of that same staircase a full year later, on the anniversary he hadn't quite realized he'd been counting toward, watching Noah take the steps 2 at a time without a flicker of hesitation, laughing at something Priya had said from the bottom, and understanding that this, finally, unremarkably, was what an ordinary Tuesday in a safe house was supposed to sound like all along. I keep coming back to the moment Noah's thumb hovered over delete, in the dark, before he decided to keep the recording instead. That's the part that gets me, not the courtroom, not the arrest, just a scared kid choosing to trust his own memory over the easier option of making the fear disappear. Would you have believed a 6-year-old over a grown adult with a calm voice and a good explanation? Be honest with yourself for a second before you answer. If this one stuck with you, tell me down in the comments, and if you've got a story like this in your own life, I'd genuinely like to hear it.